a small wooden table in a state dacha at Petrovo-Dalny, north of Moscow. The year is somewhere between 1966 and 1971. An old man sits in a wicker chair with a heavy German-made UHA reel-to-reel tape recorder humming on a side table beside him. He has been removed from power. He has been told he is a non-person. The newspapers no longer print his name. His own son has smuggled the tape recorder into the house and arranged the slow, dangerous process of moving the tapes out of the country, because the family knows that what the old man is about to say will never be allowed inside any official archive in the Soviet Union. The old man is Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev. He has been first secretary of the Communist Party. He has stared down John Kennedy over Cuba. He has banged his shoe at the United Nations. He has, by his own private admission, signed more death warrants than he can count. And now, in the slow hours of his forced retirement, he is dictating his memoirs into tapes that his son Sergei will arrange to smuggle west, eventually reaching a Time magazine correspondent named Strobe Talbott, who will translate them and bring them out as a book in 1970. He is talking about the war, the Great Patriotic War, the war the Soviet Union claims to have won alone, and what he says into that tape recorder, in the plain voice of a man who has nothing left to lose, is something that no Soviet citizen will be permitted to read in their own language for nearly 30 years. He says that without American canned meat, the Red Army would not have been able to feed itself. He says it directly. There were many jokes going around in the army about American spam, he says. It tasted good, nonetheless. Without spam, we would not have been able to feed our army. We had lost our most fertile lands, the Ukraine and the Northern Caucasus. That sentence should be impossible. The Soviet Union won the war on the Eastern Front by absorbing roughly 27 million dead, by grinding the Wehrmacht into the snows outside Moscow, by trapping an entire German field army at Stalingrad, by smashing through to Berlin in April 1945. The official Soviet history said the victory was Soviet, the price was Soviet, and the credit was Soviet. The notion that an army of more than 11 million men could not have eaten without help from a foreign capitalist power on the other side of the planet was not just embarrassing, it was the kind of admission that, in Stalin's lifetime, could have ended a man's life. Yet Khrushchev said it, and he was not the only one. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who took the surrender of Berlin, said something almost identical in 1963, in a private conversation at his own dacha, that the KGB was secretly recording without his knowledge. Stalin himself, according to Khrushchev's testimony, said it privately at his own dinner table. The men who had won the war were telling each other, in rooms they thought were private, that they could not have won without America's groceries. This is the story of how a single round can of pressed pork from a meat-packing plant in Austin, Minnesota, became one of the quiet hinges of the Second World War. It is the story of why the Soviet Union spent 40 years pretending it never happened, of why a generation of Russian veterans called that can of pork the Second Front, and of why the men who actually fought the war kept circling back to it in their old age the way a man returns to a debt he never quite paid off. To understand how an army of more than 11 million Soviet soldiers came to depend on the surplus pork shoulder of an American breakfast meat company, we have to go back to a moment when the Soviet Union still believed it could feed itself. In the spring of 1936, a Soviet Politburo member named Anastas Ivanovich Mikoyan boarded a ship for the United States. He was 40 years old, an Armenian, and the People's Commissar of the food industry. He was one of a tiny number of old Bolsheviks who had survived Stalin's inner circle without yet being shot, and the reason he survived was simple. He was useful. He was unambitious in the dangerous sense, and he had a quiet ability to learn from people his ideology said he was supposed to despise. Mikoyan was a survivor in a literal sense. In 1918, in the chaos of the Russian Civil War, he had been one of 27 Bolshevik commissars captured by anti-Bolshevik forces in Baku. The other 26 were taken into the Turkmen desert and executed. Mikoyan, by what his biographer called a clerical accident, was left off the execution list. He spent the rest of his life carrying a quiet sense that he had been spared for some purpose he could not name. He would survive Stalin's purges, when most of the men of his generation were shot, by becoming the man no one could replace, the technocrat who knew where the cans came from and how the trains ran. Stalin had sent him to America for a peculiar reason. The Soviet Union, in the middle of forced collectivization, was unable to feed itself. Stalin's policy of crushing the peasantry had produced the Great Famine of the early 1930s, in which roughly 4 million Ukrainians had starved to death in what would later be called the Holodomor, with another 2 to 3 million dying across Russia, the North Caucasus and Kazakhstan. The grain belt had been gutted, the horse herds had been slaughtered. The men and women who had actually known how to farm had been deported, executed, or driven into urban factories. The Soviet state had decided that if its peasants could not produce food, it would simply industrialize the production of food and skip the peasant entirely. Mikoyan spent 2.5 months traveling from coast to coast. He toured the great meat-packing houses of Chicago, Armour, and Swift and Wilson, where the disassembly lines moved hogs through their stages with an efficiency that astonished him. He visited dairy plants and ice cream factories and bakeries that produced bread on a scale Soviet bakers could not yet imagine. He inspected the dehydration plants where eggs were turned into yellow powder and milk was turned into white powder, both stable enough to sit in a warehouse for years. He saw, in operation, a national food industry that worked in a way the Soviet system did not. Cuts of meat that Russian peasants discarded as scrap were being sold in tins for a profit. Surplus pork shoulder, in particular, was being canned in formats designed for American supermarkets, an unpopular cut that an American company called Hormel would, the year after Mikoyan returned to Moscow, name Spam at a New Year's Eve party in 1936. The product was launched in July 1937. Its original recipe was simple: pork shoulder, water, salt, sugar, and a touch of sodium nitrate to preserve the color. Ham would be added later, in a post-war reformulation. In its earliest form, Spam was an industrial answer to the problem of what to do with a cut of meat the American consumer did not want. Mikoyan came home to Moscow with notebooks full of diagrams and processes and recipes. He brought back the idea of mass-produced ice cream, which Stalin would later joke he cared more about than communism. He brought back the architecture of the modern Soviet meat industry, and he brought back, in particular, a fascination with canned stewed meat, a product the Russians already had a name for. They called it tushonka, braised meat, a recipe that had originated centuries earlier in the Ural Mountains as a way of preserving game in jars sealed with fat and salt. Mikoyan saw what American pressure canning could do to that traditional product, and he ordered the Soviet food industry to begin producing tushonka at industrial scale. By the time the Germans invaded on June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union had a domestic canned meat industry. It was not anywhere near big enough. What happened in the first 6 months of the German invasion is one of the most catastrophic agricultural collapses in modern history. The Wehrmacht overran a strip of territory that, before the war, had produced 38% of all Soviet grain, 84% of Soviet sugar, 60% of Soviet sunflower oil, 38% of Soviet cattle, and 60% of Soviet hogs. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Russian Empire for centuries, was gone. The Black Earth belt of southern Russia was gone. Most of the pre-war pig population was either eaten by the advancing Germans, slaughtered in panic by retreating Soviet farmers, or simply abandoned in the chaos. The numbers tell the story in cold arithmetic. Soviet grain production fell from 95 million tons in 1940 to 29 million tons by 1942. Potato production fell from 75 million tons to 23 million tons. Meat production fell from 4.7 million tons before the war to 1.8 million tons. Tractors had been melted down for tanks. Workhorses had been requisitioned for the army. Half the men who had farmed the land were either in uniform or dead. The Soviet state, in less than a year, had lost more than half of its food production capacity. At the same moment it had to feed an army that would eventually grow to over 11 million men under arms. By the winter of 1941, in the besieged city of Leningrad, the bread ration had been cut by November 20th to 125 grams a day for office workers, dependents, and children. Manual laborers received 250 grams. Frontline soldiers received 500. People were boiling wallpaper paste for the flour content. Civilians were eating the leather from belts and book bindings. Roughly 800,000 civilians died of starvation during the siege, with total siege-related deaths, including soldiers and bombing victims, climbing past 1 million. Behind the lines, the situation for ordinary Soviet civilians was catastrophic. The official ration in the rear was, on paper, a pound of bread a day for a worker. In practice, in many cities, even that could not be guaranteed. The Red Army's frontline soldier had a higher priority. Under the State Defense Committee Decree No. 662, signed September 12, 1941, and the implementing army order that followed 10 days later, a soldier in combat units was supposed to receive 800 to 900 grams of bread a day, depending on the season, supplemented with meat, sugar, butter, and tea when these things existed. The phrase "when these things existed" is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence. By the spring of 1942, in many sectors, those things did not exist. A Red Army soldier might go a week with nothing but bread and water and the chance to forage in a burned-out village. The man whose job it was to fix this catastrophe was the same man who had walked through the Chicago packing houses 6 years earlier. Mikoyan had been pulled into the apparatus of the State Defense Committee, the small wartime body that ran every aspect of the Soviet war economy. He served as plenipotentiary for food and fuel from the first weeks of the war and was added as a full member of the committee in February 1942. His brief was the food, fodder, and fuel supply of the Red Army, the coordination of Lend-Lease, and the chairmanship of the committee charged with evacuating food stocks and consumer goods east of the Urals as the Wehrmacht advanced. He was, in essence, the Soviet quartermaster general, working 16 and 18-hour days in offices in the Kremlin, while the Germans were, in the autumn of 1941, less than 30 kilometers from where he sat. What he did, in the late autumn of 1941, was send a desperate request to the Americans through the new Lend-Lease channels. The request was specific. He wanted canned meat. He wanted it in volume. He wanted it shippable, storable, and edible cold from the can if necessary, because Soviet field kitchens could not always be brought forward to where the men were fighting and dying. The first cans of American Spam started arriving on Soviet docks in the early months of 1942. A Red Army quartermaster opened a crate, sampled the contents, and reported back through Mikoyan's office with a curious complaint. The men appreciated the meat, but the texture was wrong. It was too smooth, too uniform, too American. The Soviet soldier was used to identifiable chunks of meat in his canned stew, the way his mother had made it. Could the Americans, perhaps, be persuaded to make the canned pork in the Russian style? What happened next is one of the strangest small footnotes of the entire war. The Soviet government sent the recipe for tushonka, the Ural mountain peasant dish that Mikoyan had been mass-producing in Soviet plants since the late 1930s, across the Atlantic to the United States Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture handed the recipe to American meatpackers, primarily in Iowa and Ohio. By mid-1942, factories in Cincinnati and Cedar Rapids that had been producing breakfast bacon and Sunday hams a year earlier were producing svinaya tushonka, Russian-style braised pork, to Soviet specifications, in cans labeled in Cyrillic for shipment to the Eastern Front. Photographs taken by an Office of War Information photographer at the Kroger plant in Cincinnati in June 1943 show American workers spooning 1 pound of pork, lard, onions, and spice into each can. By the end of the war, the United States had shipped to the Soviet Union approximately 266,000 tons of tushonka made in America to a Russian recipe. It had also shipped roughly 665,000 tons of canned meat in total, including Spam itself, lard, butter, dehydrated eggs, dehydrated milk, sugar, flour, and dehydrated soup concentrates. The total tonnage of food shipped to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, by the time the program ended in September 1945, came to roughly 4.5 million tons. There is a question that has been argued by historians for 60 years, and that needs to be confronted directly. Did this food arrive in time to matter at the moments that decided the war? The honest answer is that it depends on which battle you are asking about. The food did not arrive in any meaningful quantity in time for the Battle of Moscow in the winter of 1941-42. That battle was won by Soviet soldiers eating Soviet bread, with Lend-Lease food still sitting on docks in Iran or being loaded in American ports. The food did not arrive in time for the early stages of Stalingrad either. The men of the 62nd Army, fighting in the rubble of that city in the autumn of 1942, ate captured German rations more often than they ate American ones. But by the time the war turned decisively, in the second half of 1943 and into 1944, the pipeline was running at full capacity. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank engagement in history, was fought by a Red Army that had begun to receive American food in serious volume. The great offensives that followed, Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944 that destroyed German Army Group Center, the Vistula-Oder offensive of January 1945 that put Soviet troops on the doorstep of Berlin, were fought by men eating from American cans, riding on American trucks, wearing American boots. The Soviet soldier who shot the last German out of the Reichstag in May 1945 had almost certainly, at some point in the previous 18 months, eaten a tin of pork shipped from the Midwest of the United States. To get a sense of what that meant on the ground, consider a single statistic. In the first months of 1943, in the immediate aftermath of Stalingrad, American agricultural shipments alone accounted for 17% of the calories consumed by the Red Army and roughly half of the fats. Half the fat in the diet of every Soviet soldier on the line that winter came out of an American can. The bread on his table was Soviet. The pork inside it was, more often than not, raised on a farm in Iowa, slaughtered in a plant in Cedar Rapids, and shipped through a port in southern Iran. He did not always know that. His commanders did. His commissars did. And the men in the Kremlin most certainly did. This is the part of the story that opens up the question we have to answer. The Soviet Union won the war, by any honest measure, on the backs of its own soldiers. 2 of every 3 German divisions destroyed in the Second World War were destroyed by the Red Army. 80% of all German combat deaths happened on the Eastern Front. The Soviet contribution to the defeat of fascism was not invented and was not exaggerated. It was real, it was costly, and it was decisive. So why then were Khrushchev and Zhukov and Stalin himself, in private, unable to stop circling back to a few American cans of meat as the thing without which the whole edifice would have collapsed? The answer is in the geography of how that food got there, and it begins on a railway line that runs through one of the strangest theaters of the entire war. In the late summer of 1941, a few weeks after the German invasion of Russia, the British and the Soviets together did something that gets very little attention in any war narrative aimed at Western audiences. They invaded Iran. The country, then ruled by Reza Shah Pahlavi, was officially neutral but was widely seen by the Allies as friendly to the Axis. More importantly, Iran sat on top of a railway built between 1927 and 1938, the Trans-Iranian Railway, which ran roughly 865 miles from the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, crossing 2 mountain ranges and more than 300 bridges and 224 tunnels along the way. The Allies wanted that railway. On August 25, 1941, in an operation codenamed Countenance, they took it. The Shah was forced to abdicate in favor of his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza, who would rule Iran for the next 37 years. What followed was the construction of one of the great forgotten supply efforts of the 20th century. The American Persian Gulf Command, eventually grown to 30,000 troops under Major General Donald H. Connolly, took over operation of the Trans-Iranian Railway from the British in December 1942, when the first major echelon of American soldiers, more than 5,000 men, came ashore at Khorramshahr. They expanded the ports at Khorramshahr and Bandar Shahpur. They built truck assembly plants in the desert where American workers, helped by tens of thousands of locally hired Iranians, took crated American Studebaker trucks out of wooden boxes and bolted them together on concrete pads in summer temperatures that exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit. They built airfields where Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters were assembled from crates and flown north to the Soviet Union with the white American star on the wing painted over and replaced with a red Soviet one before the planes ever left Iranian airspace. The men of the Persian Gulf Command served in conditions that almost no American soldier of the war complained about more loudly. The summer heat at Khorramshahr regularly hit 115 degrees in the shade. Sandstorms could last for days, grinding into engines and into eyes and into the skin between a man's fingers until it bled. There was no enemy. There was no glory. There were no medals being handed out for assembling trucks. The soldiers stationed there had a few colourful names for the place, and none of them were complimentary. But the trucks they bolted together in that desert ended up under the Katyusha rocket launchers that fired into German lines outside Kursk. The cans they unloaded ended up in the packs of Soviet riflemen advancing toward Berlin. Almost none of the American soldiers who served in the Persian corridor ever met a Soviet soldier. They simply built the road and watched the goods disappear north. The freight that came up that line was almost biblical in its variety. Steel ingots, aluminum sheets, aviation fuel, boxes of dehydrated potatoes, crates of leather work boots, eventually more than 15 million pairs of them, enough to put a proper pair of boots on every fighting soldier in the Red Army at war's peak, spools of telephone wire long enough, in total, to wrap around the equator 40 times, locomotives, boxcars, and cans. Cans by the millions, cans of pork, cans of beef, cans of condensed milk, cans of dehydrated soup. They moved north on Studebaker trucks driven by Soviet drivers and Iranians hired by Soviet purchasing agents, climbing through mountain passes, descending into the Soviet zone, crossing the border at places like Astara and Julfa, bound for the railheads of Soviet Azerbaijan. Of the roughly 17.5 million long tons of American Lend-Lease cargo shipped to the Soviet Union over the course of the war, about 4 million long tons, close to a quarter of the total, came up that single corridor. Another quarter, around 4 million long tons, came over the Arctic, in the famous PQ convoys to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk that had to fight their way past German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers based in Norway. The largest single share, nearly half of the entire flow at more than 8 million long tons, came across the Pacific, where Soviet-flagged merchant ships, untouchable because the Soviet Union and Japan were still officially at peace, sailed from Seattle and Portland to Vladivostok, carrying cargo that the Japanese, by treaty, could not attack. The Arctic convoys were the most dangerous. Convoy PQ-17, which sailed from Iceland on June 27, 1942, was ordered by the British First Sea Lord to scatter on July 4, under intelligence reports of an imminent attack by the German battleship Tirpitz. The order was a catastrophe. Stripped of its escort, the convoy was hunted apart over the following days by U-boats and Luftwaffe aircraft. Of the 35 merchant ships that had set out, only 11 reached Soviet ports. 24 were lost. Among the cargo that went to the bottom of the Barents Sea were close to 100,000 tons of supplies, including more than 3,000 motor vehicles, 430 Sherman tanks, 210 aircraft, and tens of thousands of tons of food. After PQ-17, the Arctic route was effectively suspended for months. It was that suspension, more than any other single operational fact, that turned the Persian corridor from a secondary route into one of the central arteries of the Soviet war effort. The Pacific route is the one almost no one remembers. The cargoes that crossed it could not include weapons, because the Japanese, although at war with America, were still officially at peace with the Soviet Union under a neutrality pact signed in April 1941, so American factories sent food, trucks, raw materials, locomotives, fuel. The Japanese, watching Soviet ships sail past their home islands carrying enemy cargo, could only watch. They would not break the peace until August 1945, days before the war ended, by which time the food and the trucks and the trains had been arriving in Vladivostok for nearly 4 years. By the middle of 1943, those three routes combined were delivering goods to the Soviet Union at a rate that would total, by war's end, $11.3 billion in 1945 money. That is roughly $200 billion in today's currency. Inside that vast river of material, the food was, by tonnage, only about 13%, but that 13% landed in a country whose own food production had been cut in half. It landed at the precise moment when the Red Army was being asked to do the largest, most logistically demanding offensive operations in the history of warfare. And it landed in the form of cans that did not need refrigeration, did not spoil, did not require a field kitchen, and could be carried in a soldier's pack for days without deteriorating. There is a Soviet veteran's story that captures what this meant in the actual life of a frontline soldier. The men of the Red Army gave the American canned meat a nickname. They called it the Second Front. The joke was bitter. For 3 years, from 1941 to mid-1944, Stalin had been demanding that his Western allies open a real second front in France to take pressure off the Eastern Front. The British and the Americans, for reasons of shipping and strategy, kept delaying. While they delayed, the Red Army absorbed casualty rates that no other army on Earth has ever sustained. So when the food arrived from America in cans, and the actual Second Front did not, Soviet soldiers gave the cans the name, "This is the Second Front. This is what we got instead of soldiers." They ate it anyway. They ate it gratefully. But the name stuck. Egg powder, which the Americans dehydrated in plants that scaled up enormously for the war, was given another nickname. The men called it Roosevelt's eggs. The Russian word for eggs, yaitsa, is also the slang word for testicles. The joke wrote itself. These are the small human details that the official Soviet histories would not record, that Mikoyan would not put in his memoirs, that the men in the Kremlin would not discuss in any meeting that produced a transcript. They are the kind of details that survive in the diaries and post-war recollections of frontline officers and penal company commanders, the kind of accounts that began to be published openly only after the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The pattern in those accounts is consistent. The supply of hot food from field kitchens during defensive operations was something the men learned to rely on. That supply broke down catastrophically the moment they began to advance. When you advanced, what you carried in your pack became your kitchen. By 1944, what you carried was, with increasing frequency, an American can. If you think about that for a moment, you understand why 3 of the most powerful men the Soviet Union ever produced kept saying the same thing in private when no one was listening. The Soviet Union won the war. The Soviet soldier won the war. But what kept the Soviet soldier on his feet long enough to win, in the second half of the war when the Red Army was punching west into Belarus and Poland and East Prussia, was sitting in a tin can, made in Iowa, to a Russian recipe, shipped through Iran, opened with a soldier's bayonet in a frozen field outside Kharkov. Now we have to confront the harder question. If the food was that important, why did the official Soviet account spend the next 40 years pretending it had never happened? The answer is partly ideological, and partly something deeper, something closer to shame. The Soviet Union, after 1945, built its entire post-war legitimacy on the claim that the Communist Party and the Soviet people, working together with no help from anyone, had crushed the largest, most modern army on Earth and had paid the largest price ever paid in human history to do it. That story was true in its outlines. It became less and less true the closer you looked at the supply chain. To admit, in 1947 or 1957 or 1967, that half the fat in a Red Army soldier's diet during the decisive battles of 1943 had come out of an American can was to admit something the Soviet state could not afford to admit. It was to admit that the world's first workers' paradise could not feed its own workers. It was to admit that capitalist agriculture, the thing Marxist-Leninist theory said was inherently doomed and inferior, had outproduced socialist agriculture by such a margin that the surplus could be shipped halfway around the world to keep the socialist army alive. So the Soviet state minimized. A senior Soviet planner named Nikolai Voznesensky, in a post-war economic study, gave a figure for total Lend-Lease aid as a percentage of total Soviet wartime production. He put it at roughly 4%. The figure was technically not a lie. 4% was, in raw money terms, not far off the truth. But it was the kind of statistic that exists to mislead. If you ship a man 4% of the calories he needs to live, you have not given him a small percentage of his needs. You have given him the difference between dying and living. Voznesensky was shot in 1950 during the Leningrad affair, partly for reasons unrelated, and partly because his statistical work had begun to attract the wrong kind of attention. His 4% figure, however, survived him. It became the ceiling that Soviet historians worked under for decades. The men who knew better could not say so in print. Mikoyan, who had personally negotiated much of the Lend-Lease food protocol and who knew exactly what it had taken to keep the Red Army eating, said publicly only what the party allowed him to say. In his unpublished memoirs and in private conversations recalled by family members after his death, however, he expressed a different view, one in which the help from across the ocean was the difference between Soviet survival and collapse. Stalin, according to the testimony of the men who sat at his table, was even blunter. At a dinner during the Tehran Conference on November 30, 1943, he raised a toast to the United States that the American ambassador, Averell Harriman, would later set down word for word in his own memoir. Stalin said he wanted to tell the room what, from the Russian point of view, the President and the United States had done for the war. The most important things in this war, he said, were the machines. The United States, he said, was a country of machines, and without those machines, supplied through Lend-Lease, the Allies would have lost the war. The toast was understood by the British and Americans present as a piece of diplomatic flattery. Whether Stalin meant it as flattery or as something closer to plain accounting, only the men closest to him would know. Khrushchev, in retirement, would say plainly that Stalin meant it. Khrushchev's account is the cleanest piece of testimony we have. He wrote that Stalin, in conversations among his inner circle, said directly that if the United States had not helped them, they would not have won the war. That if they had had to fight Nazi Germany one-on-one, they could not have stood up against German pressure, and they would have lost the war. Khrushchev wrote that he was fully in agreement with Stalin when he heard those words, and that he was even more in agreement, looking back, by the time he was dictating his memoirs in retirement. This is one of the most remarkable admissions any Soviet leader ever made. It does not appear in any Soviet history textbook. It did not appear in the official histories of the Great Patriotic War published in Moscow during Khrushchev's own time in power. The reason is simple. Khrushchev knew, as Stalin had known, that the Soviet system could not survive the open admission that its great founding triumph had depended on capitalist help. Marshal Zhukov said something nearly identical in a conversation at his own dacha he believed was completely private in 1963. The KGB was recording. Zhukov said that some people now claimed the Allies had not really helped them, but that one could not deny that the Americans had shipped material without which the Soviet Union could not have equipped its reserves or continued the war. He said the Americans had provided vital explosives and gunpowder. He said, "And how much steel? Could we really have set up the production of our tanks without American steel? And now," he said with bitterness, "they are saying that we had plenty of everything on our own." The KGB file on that conversation, a transcript made by men whose job it was to report on Zhukov's loyalty, sat in a Soviet archive for nearly 30 years. It came out only after the collapse of the Soviet Union. By the time anyone in Russia could read what the country's most decorated soldier had actually said in private, the country he had said it inside no longer existed. The Russian historian Boris Sokolov, working in the 1990s when the archives finally began to open, did the arithmetic Voznesensky had spent his career obscuring. In a paper published in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies in 1994, Sokolov wrote that without Lend-Lease the Red Army would have been short about a third of its ammunition, half of its aircraft, and half of its tanks. There would have been constant shortages of transportation and fuel. The railroads, he wrote, would have periodically come to a halt. Soviet forces would have been much more poorly coordinated for lack of radios, almost half of which came from America. And, he wrote elsewhere in the same body of work, the army would have been perpetually hungry without American canned meat and fats. Perpetually hungry. That is the thing Khrushchev was reaching for in the back room of his retirement dacha when he said that without Spam they could not have fed their army. He was not exaggerating for rhetorical effect. He was describing, in the plainest possible language, an arithmetic of survival that he had personally watched. Khrushchev had a second admission, separate from the one about the food, that the Soviet historians of his time were equally unwilling to print. He said that after Stalin's death, he had come to realize that almost all of the Red Army's artillery in the second half of the war had been mounted on American trucks. The Studebaker U.S.S, a 2.5-ton truck built in South Bend, Indiana, had become the standard mount for the famous Katyusha rocket launcher. Roughly 1,800 Katyushas were mounted on Studebakers. Soviet soldiers gave the truck a nickname of its own, They called it the Studa. The word became, for a generation of Russian veterans, a synonym for reliability. If a piece of equipment was good, you said it was a Studa. The Soviet automotive industry tried for decades after the war to build a truck as good as the Studa. They never quite succeeded. Khrushchev's point was not that the trucks won the war. His point was that the great Soviet offensives of 1944 and 1945, the offensives that pushed the Wehrmacht out of Russia and across Poland and into Germany, depended on a kind of operational mobility that the Red Army did not possess in 1941. By 1944, the Soviet riflemen walked. The Soviet supply train, by contrast, rolled. It rolled on more than 400,000 American trucks. Just imagine, Khrushchev said into the tape recorder, how we would have advanced from Stalingrad to Berlin without them. Our losses would have been colossal, because we would have had no maneuverability. There is a final piece of this story that very few people, even today, hear. By the time the war ended and the Lend-Lease pipeline was shut off in September 1945, the canned meat had become so embedded in the everyday food supply of the Soviet Union that it could not simply disappear. The American Spam went home with the American soldiers and largely disappeared from the Soviet diet. The American-made tushonka, however, did not. It had been produced in Iowa and Ohio according to a Russian recipe, shipped to Russian docks in Russian-labeled cans, and eaten by Russian soldiers and civilians for 3 years. It tasted Russian. It was Russian, in everything but the country where its pigs had been raised. After the war, the Soviet Union continued to produce tushonka domestically, on the industrial lines Mikoyan had built before the war, and expanded during it. The cans went out to Soviet shops, Soviet army units, Soviet expedition teams, Soviet pioneer camps. By the 1970s, tushonka was being exported to Cuba and across the Soviet bloc as a symbol of socialist modernity, a humble can of stewed pork that the Soviet propaganda machine had quietly elevated into proof that the planned economy could feed its people. Almost no one outside a small circle of historians and old veterans remembered that the recipe had gone west to America in 1942 and come back as the food that kept the Red Army alive. So here, at last, is the answer to the question of why a former First Secretary of the Communist Party, dictating his memoirs into a tape recorder in an internal exile that the Soviet state refused even to acknowledge, kept circling back to a can of meat. The answer is not that Spam won the war. It did not. The Red Army won the war. The Soviet civilians who froze and starved and worked 12-hour shifts in Ural factories built behind makeshift walls won the war. The 27 million Soviet dead won the war. No tin of pork shoulder is going to take that from them, and no honest accounting should pretend otherwise. But the men who actually fought the war knew something the official histories could not say. They knew that an army does not run on courage, it runs on calories. They knew that the moment when the Wehrmacht broke at Stalingrad and Kursk, and the great offensives of 1944, was the moment when Soviet soldiers began routinely going into battle with American food in their packs, riding on American trucks down roads kept open by American steel, with American boots on their feet. They knew that the Soviet state, in those years, had been kept alive by a partnership it could never publicly acknowledge with a country whose entire economic system it was politically committed to destroying. And they knew, finally, that the food in particular, the simple round cans labelled in Cyrillic, was the part of the help that touched every single soldier on the line. A Soviet rifleman might never see an American truck if his unit fought on foot. He might never see an American plane if the Luftwaffe stayed away from his sector. But sooner or later, in 1943 or 1944 or 1945, in Belorussia or Poland or East Prussia, he would open a can stamped in a foreign language and eat from it because his field kitchen had not caught up to the front, and he had not had hot food in 3 days. That can is what the old men in the Soviet Politburo could not stop coming back to in their final years. It was not the largest part of the help. It was the most personal one. It was the part they had felt themselves, on their own tongues, in the years when the country they ran was trying to feed an army of more than 11 million men out of half its pre-war fields. When Khrushchev finally said it out loud, in that quiet room north of Moscow with the German tape recorder running, he was not making a metaphor. He was making a confession. He was describing the moment in his own life when he had realized that the great Soviet experiment, the one his entire political identity was built around, had been kept upright in its hour of greatest danger by the surplus pork shoulder of a Midwestern American meatpacker who had originally thrown it into a tin because he didn't know what else to do with it. If your grandfather or great-grandfather served on the Eastern Front in the Red Army, in any unit, on any sector, I would consider it a privilege to read about him in the comments. What unit? Where he fought? What he remembered? The official histories have had 80 years to tell their version of the story. The men themselves, in most cases, told their families a different one. Those private versions, the ones that include the can of pork and the worn-out boots and the field kitchen that never caught up, are the actual record. They deserve to be preserved. There is one detail in this whole story that I keep returning to. In June 1943, a photographer named Howard R. Holland walked into the Kroger plant in Cincinnati and took a series of photographs for the United States Office of War Information. They are still preserved in the Library of Congress. One picture shows an American woman in a white uniform, her hair tied back, standing in front of a long line of empty tin cans. She is using a metal spoon to drop a measured portion of pork, shoulder, lard, onion, and spice into each can as it moves past her on the line. The cans are labeled in Cyrillic. They are bound, eventually, for a port on the Persian Gulf, then a railway through the mountains of Iran, then a truck convoy across the border into Soviet Azerbaijan, and then a railhead somewhere on the long road to the front. She does not know the name of the soldier who will eat from the can she is filling. She does not speak his language. She will probably never know whether he survived the war or not. She is filling the can because it is her job, because there is a war on, and because somewhere in the system someone has decided that this can needs to exist. 80 years later, what she packed is still part of the story Soviet historians could not finish telling. The state she was helping to feed spent 4 decades trying to erase her from the record. The men who had eaten from her cans, when they finally spoke in private. They spoke into hidden microphones, their security services planted in their dachas. They spoke into smuggled tape recorders their sons carried west. They spoke at dinner tables to journalists they trusted, in conversations the KGB was always recording. And what they said, almost without exception, was a version of the same thing. The country they had served could not have done what it did alone. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It helps the channel find the people who care about getting the war right, including the parts that do not flatter anyone. Subscribe if you want more of these. There are dozens of them. Most of them are about the small, practical, unglamorous things that decided enormous events and the ordinary people on every side of the line who lived inside those things without ever fully understanding what they were a part of. The men who fought the Eastern Front on whichever side did not eat doctrine. They ate what was in front of them. And in the years when it mattered most, what was in front of millions of Soviet soldiers, on the table next to the bread, was a small round can with a label they could not always read, opened with a bayonet, eaten cold on a winter morning before the field kitchen caught up. That can did not win the war. The men did. But the men who won the war never forgot what was in the can, and as long as we remember them, neither should we.